Hi, this is Dr. Morris. I just wanted to talk to you briefly about working on your case study, about the process of research and preparation. I want to look closely at the example of the paper I gave you by Carisha Singleton. If you haven't read it for last week, I really encourage you to go back and read it before you listen to this presentation. In fact, it might be good to have it in front of you as you're listening to the presentation. So, one thing I'd like to note is that Carisha doesn't necessarily, well, she doesn't divide the paper into three parts. And this paper was written several years ago, so I probably didn't necessarily tell them to divide it into parts. I'm asking you to divide it into parts, so it would be good to label the sections. So, in terms of the research, one of the things you need to establish in part one is the problem, which is an introduction to the issue. And you can see in Carisha's introductory paragraph that she does a variety of things. She establishes the nature of the problem, she uses facts to tell us about it, hence logos, and she mentions her own connection to the issue. So she does a lot of work in this introductory paragraph to really establish what's going on. In addition, as part of part one, she talks about the history of the issue and what the nature has been of the issue. That's another aspect of part one. In part two, she identifies very specifically the group that she's looking at, fertility for colored girls. So she's looking at the details of that. Notice how specific she is. She's giving the history, founded in 2012, who's founded it. So it's very clear what she's looking at. She then she talks a lot about what the advocacy has been doing with this group, and basically says, you know, it's great that this group exists, but there are gaps in the advocacy. And this is a really important thing to do because it set her up for her advocacy assignment. So since there's gaps, she can fill in those gaps with her own advocacy project. So she notes specifically in this particular case that she's looking at, for example, the Facebook page, and she notes that it hasn't been updated for quite a while. And that's clearly a problem, particularly with any sort of medical issue, because things change rapidly in that sort of scenario. So, another part of her research that she's done is to identify gaps in the advocacy. Finally, in part three, she talks about what I can do. So she identifies the people who she can reach, what her sphere of influence is, and who would be the ideal people. Notice that the fact that she deals with infertility sets her up very nicely to have a sphere of influence. We're more likely to be connected to people through, I might add, the rhetorical proof of emotion, to care about an issue, and also through credibility to be informed about an issue because somebody has dealt with the experience themselves. Now, there are a couple of things that I wish Carisha would have done that I'd like to see you do, and that is to use rhetorical concepts to help analyze the case. That's going to develop part two, and it's going to make it longer. In addition, she uses lots of sources, and she has a works cited at the end of the paper, which are great. But within the paper, she doesn't note where she got the information she got. So she needs to cite her sources. And third, I would recommend that she look at just the Facebook page so that she can do a closer analysis. You can't analyze everything a group does. So why not use the Facebook page as the main group that you're doing? So let's go back to the beginning. So the first thing in part one that you need to do is identify the problem, which involves your connection to it, the history of the problem, the background of the problem, and you might also mention audience matters, and you can see how Carisha mentions audience matters. In part two, you need to introduce us to the case. I would, just to repeat, like to have seen Carisha look at the Facebook page, and then she could have described what was going on there in some more specificity. So the page leads off with a pinned post that says blah, 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 blah. And it makes use of images or it doesn't make use of images. And these are appeals to ethos, pathos, or logos, whichever it is. In addition, in part two, you need to locate the gaps or the problems. So clearly one of hers is the outdatedness of it. And you can say the last post was from 2015 and things have, undoubtedly changed since then. And then in part three, you need to think about what you could personally do as an advocate and what your sphere of influence is. That is, where you might have an impact. What particular groups of people are most likely to pay attention to you, and why? Why are you going to be an influence? We'll talk a little bit more about spheres of influence in Unit 4. But for right now, just think about people or the kinds of people that you might have access to. And you don't need to go into too much depth there. I'd really like to see part 2 be the biggest and parts 1 and 3 be a little smaller. I'm mostly interested in analysis so that we can see what's being done so that you don't redo that. And so that you're setting this up. So keep in mind, this is going to be one component of your next assignment. So getting all the work done here is really going to set you up nicely for part 4. So don't forget to use rhetorical concepts, don't forget to cite sources, and don't forget to hone in on a very particular aspect of the advocacy. Please go to the discussion board that says questions if you have any questions, and I'd be glad to answer them, or send me an email and we'll set up a conversation so I can answer questions. Hope you're all well. Bye-bye.